Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about actually good books. Amazing, isn't it? Since we're on break from Wheel of Time until Monday, I thought I'll do something that I wanted to do or should have done in December. Remember, I did videos on The Shadow of the Torturer and The Claw of the Conciliator, the book of the new sun. Yeah, right. And I also in that read-along buddy read thing that we had going on at the Unabridged Burners, together with Chancellor of Moonspawn and other people. We had as a discussion in December of Sword of the Lictor, and then Christmas happened, and then my annual New Year's depression happened, and all this other stuff, and I forgot to make a video on Sword of the Lictor. And yeah. So what I did is I reread the entire thing today. Yes, I started this morning at 7 in the morning, and I read the entire thing. Because I'm still I'm technically still COVID positive, so I'm in isolation, quarantine, and I have nothing else to do but sit here and read books, because I'm running out of beer. So that's what I'm doing. And this is me talking about Sword of the Lictor, Book 3, in The Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe from 1981. So let's talk about it, shall we? Well, cheers. All right. So we'll do this the proper way. I will not give you a synopsis. I assume that at this point you have read the book. This is book 3 in a series. You've come this far, I assume you've read it, or you're just in general interested and don't mind spoilers. Apart from it, it's hard to spoil this book. So yeah, Book 3, Severian marching all the way from Thrax to Lake Diaterna, which we don't know, and from fortress to fortress, as he says himself. And so it's a bit more of a travel book compared to the last one, where he's, well, there's also traveling going on, but this time he's mostly alone-ish, I guess, is how I would call it this time around. And it ends almost with with a pretty brutal ending when he loses the sword, Terminus Est, and he also maybe loses the claw of the Conciliator in some form or other. So there's dramatic shit going down. I still think Shadow of the Torturer is my favorite volume of that book of the New Sun, but I do like this one a lot as well. And I want to talk about some of my favorite aspects of it, some of the things that I think are interesting as a whole when we talk about what Gene Wolfe does with Book of the New Sun and how he does what he does, and that kind of thing, because this is such a complex kind of book, and I feel it's important to figure out why I like it. Well, maybe you like it, what people like about it, and what makes it so unique or influential, if it has been unique or influential in a way. So there might be some overlap with those previous 2 videos, because it's so long ago, and I can't stand the sound of my own voice, so I did not go and rewatch them. I apologize in that case, but I assume it's also been ages for you to watch them, so there we go. Sword of the Lictor. And what I want to look at here mostly is time and strangeness and how we talk about these kind of things. Because, as you know, the Book of the New Sun is supposed to take place at the end of human history in the far, 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 far future. I guess we're talking, depending on what we look at, we're talking definitely millions of years in the future. And I think that's a very interesting thing to look at, because compared to a lot of fantasy, even second world fantasy, or stuff that's supposed to take place in our world, there's very few books that actually go so far out of their way to actually bring strangeness or difference across. Right? It's a lot of fantasy, for example, and science fiction is very much about we assume we know how shit works. And it's your classic how I thought the Middle Ages in Europe looked kind of stuff, right? That's a lot of how that works. And then we go out and describe, like authors go out and describe in minute detail things that are not that different from what we have today, right? Wheel of Time, I'll just like drop it here for a moment, is definitely a good example for what I mean, right? Because the world there is fairly medieval European, maybe early Renaissance European. And yet Robert Jordan spends a lot of time on describing clothes and describing buildings and stuff and so forth, describing something that is not that different from what we have. On the other hand, however, with this book, where stuff is wildly different, is unique in all kinds of ways, almost in a way that is, and this is part of what we are talking about here, impossible for us to imagine. And that's where the trick lies. It's impossible for us to imagine how our planet and how humanity will look in millions of years. And yet, when you read this book, it's very easy to ignore all of that. And the reason for that is obviously what Gene Wolfe always does with his unreliable narrators. And I want to look at that, and then I want to pick up a few interesting examples of how Wolfe, through the voice of Severian, conveys this extreme distance. So the first thing, of course, is that since we have the narrative written by Severian, and while technically he always claims that he's writing it for people that come after him or whenever, he writes more or less to people in his time, and it's a very interesting aspect, I feel, the way Gene Wolfe manages to write down a story and withhold a lot of information from the reader. And that makes a lot of sense, because if we talk, about stuff that happens all the time, a lot of the stuff we leave out of our stories, a lot of the stuff, descriptions, well, all these things are, stuff that is just absolutely normal for us, usual, right? We ignore all of these bits and pieces. We leave them out because we assume that people have a basis of communication, right? We have a basis of communication. We have sort of slightly similar experiences, or at least the people we communicate with have a slightly different, obviously slightly different, but like mostly similar experiences, so we understand what we mean. It's a very interesting thing that I want to talk about later, as like in a separate video as well, because right when I say house, you have an image of house in your mind. When I say car and stuff, we have images in our minds that are relatively similar. Now, the specifics may vary, but when I say car, what you probably have in your mind is something with a combustion engine, or maybe an electric engine at this point, usually four-wheeled driving vehicle. That's sort of what we have in mind, right? Has four wheels, has a place to sit, has some sort of engine that drives it. That's what we think of when we think car. You may think of a sports car, I may think of a pickup truck, it doesn't matter. But we understand, and we can then talk about what a car does. Now, what Gene Wolfe does, and he explicitly mentions that when he says, I had to pick words or change words, is he uses words that signify something that may be vastly different. A perfect example is the so-called destrier. Right? He talks about destriers a lot. Now, destriers are heavy war horses, technically. But it is also very clear at specific points in the narrative that we don't, like when Severian says destrier, or what Gene Wolfe, as fictitious translator of Severian's text, calls the destrier, is something very, very different. It just fulfills the same function, which is an animal as a riding animal. It could be a rideable dinosaur. We don't know. It could be anything, but he chooses that word because of this function. And because we don't know that, and we only find out over time, when we read this book, when we start reading Book of the New Sun, We assume it's a horse. I guess like those of you who know what destriers are, probably when you started reading that book, you had in mind people riding horses. But at no point in the entire narrative is it said that destriers look like horses. There's a lot of these kind of examples in these books where we have perfectly normal words, and sometimes it's clear, like from the context, that it can't be the same thing, right? When we talk about soldiers, and they're having lances, but those lances shoot energy bolts. So apparently, lances are not what we might consider a lance, which is, basically a fancy spear for people on horseback. No, it's apparently some sort of gun. Same with like an arbalist. Now, you and me probably know what an arbalist is. It's like some form of crossbow. But they're probably not running around in crossbows. Life in Book of the New Sun does not look medieval at any point. It just is couched in the language, in a, almost in a historical language in a way. And that's something that I find very, very interesting, because through this like slight alienation that we have in bits and pieces throughout the narrative, it builds up that idea that this is very different. And from there on out, we have all the freedom of our minds to imagine that shit the way we want. Now, how do we actually convey that huge distance of language, of time that is in these books? And I think one of them is in Gene Wolfe's choice of words. And what I mean is, especially in this book, it comes up a bunch of times because we talk a lot about like animals in this one. And now, we've spoken about this before, like Gene Wolfe's prose is obviously a more Baroque kind of prose, and a lot of times he uses words from the Greek or Latin language with all kinds of, the connotations with that. And what he does here, when he talks about the fauna, a lot of times, he uses prehistoric animals, right? He talks about smilodons. He doesn't talk about tigers. He talks about a smilodon. Or when he talks about... at some point, he talks about the size of a Tyrannosaurus Rex. And I'm like, dinosaurs. Or later on, the gigantic birds, which may or may not be condors, because we still assume that this takes place somewhere in the south of America. He talks about the Teratornis, the terror bird. They are flying out up there. And for picking that specific language of the prehistoric fauna, not just, he talks about mastodons instead of, elephants. And I feel what he conveys with that, and I think that's the trick there, is these are prehistoric animals. Dinosaur world, in our imagination, and the way it has been portrayed in, children's books, Land Before Time movies, and all of that stuff, is hugely different. It feels ancient in a way that, say, ancient Greeks or 300, or the Roman Empire don't feel. Even though, he uses that kind of language when it comes to soldiers and stuff as well. It feels different than Middle Ages. It feels vastly different, more exotic. There's stuff that, at least, over time, at least in the 80s, still, when we thought about dinosaurs, we thought about like all kinds of like insanely different stuff. So the feeling of time distance that we have is larger when Wolfe picks these specific texts in a way. Now, what he also does, and I think this is also absolutely fascinating and interesting, is he flips it. Because normally when we talk about dinosaurs, we think about stuff that happened millions of years in the past. Well, I mean, with Smilodons, it's not exactly millions, but you know what I mean, right? We talk about Tyrannosaurus Rex. That guy was like 65 million years ago, 67, something like that. Look, my dinosaur days are long gone, which is a shame, but Point is, we think of the past and the distance in the past, but by flipping it, he basically puts us, the readers, now into the position of the dinosaurs and Severian and gang into that far distance. And what it should do with us, the reader, is should exactly that. It should make us realize how different that world is that he describes. And I find this very interesting. There's other hints of that, right? When in this book, when Severian climbs down that mountainside, where you can see human history as fossils in the wall, in that cliff wall, right? And now, obviously, I mean, we know about archaeology. I have archaeologist friends, right? But we know that archaeology exists. But the way he describes it, to say there's layers and layers and layers. There's we're not talking centuries. We're not even talking millennia. We're talking millions of years, entire Earth ages, like eons, basically, of human history compressed in a way and stuff. And that gives us that feeling of far distance. And I think it's very interesting to look at how we read these books and what kind of images we have in our head of how that world looks and how it feels in a way. And then he does that through these small kinds of hints on the side, right? For example, there's mentions on the side that all these animals that we are talking about right now in Book of the New Sun are all aliens. They're all alien. There's one small part of a sentence when he talks about when we brought animals back from the stars after and it is implied that humanity hunted or destroyed every almost all animal species on the planet. They all went extinct, and then planet Earth was repopulated with animals from the stars. Now, some of them may have been, animals from planet Earth that were, transported into the stars somewhere and then brought back. But others, like the Alzabo, which is, holy shit, still one of the most fascinating creatures everywhere. Anyway, were brought back and are very different. That's our next hint that, yes, just because he says destrier, he calls something a horse. Well, he doesn't call it a horse, he calls it a destrier or whatever he calls it. This does not mean that these are the animals we have in mind. They just fulfill the same function. Which obviously leads into something that we need to talk later when it's about language. Another bit where he does what he does there is when we talk about human history and memory. Now these books are full of these small vignettes of other stories. There was an earlier one when they when Severian reads from that book and talks about, which is basically the story of Theseus and the Minotaur. This time around, we have one of my favorite, if not the favorite of these vignettes and stories in the book. And that is the story of the boy called Frog that Severian, tall Severian, reads to little Severian. And it is insanely fascinating because it is written like a retelling almost of mythology. I don't know if you've ever read 19th century or earlier mythology books like Thomas Bulfinch or stuff like that, right? They have a very specific language to retell mythology, a very abstract way with some bits and pieces of dialogue in it and so forth. And what he does with that story, the story of the boy called Frog, he adopts that specific type of prose. Then he mixes elements from a bunch of pieces of literature. The first and foremost is there, I guess, a bit of the Moses story with the boy being, set onto the river in a reed basket. The Romulus and Remus story with the two brothers and the founding of Rome with the plowing of that furrow and the one boy jumping over it and then being killed because of him mocking the others. We get that in there, and then we obviously get The Jungle Book by Rudyard Kipling, and this is also extremely interesting. Because what he does here, apart from just showing his sheer mastery of prose and how to mix and match stories into something cohesive and coherent, what he does here as well is he compresses time, right? We have the story of Romulus and Remus and maybe bits and pieces of even older mythology in there. especially the bit with like the one of those goddesses being, becoming pregnant from a flower. That reminds me of, I mean, there's a scene in the Kalevala where that happens, which is a super weird retelling of the story of Jesus Christ. But yeah, it's something that we've seen before in all kinds of mythology. He takes these like old mythology, the story of Romulus and Remus, which is not old mythology, but like Roman Empire, no, Roman Republic literature. So roughly 2,200 year old text, compared to something like even like probably from an oral tradition background, and then he adds to this a early 20th century novel, and he mixes all of that into one cohesive text that he then portrays as a retelling of a very, very, very old story because of the language he chooses for that. And that's another way, because the further back we look in time, the more time compresses, history compresses, right? From where we're standing, because it's relative, right? From where we're standing, I guess the difference between the Peloponnesian War and the Persian War, if you want to call it the Persian War, feels like it's like next, basically the same time. There's almost half a century up to a century between those two, and the time compresses. Stories compress the further back we look, in a way, right? 65 to 70 million years doesn't sound like a lot when you look at like hundreds of millions of years in the past, right? But it makes a huge difference. And through the way he does that, he kind of gives us an image of how that feels, because it feels basically we take thousands of years of human history and compress them into one story that is just, 2 paragraphs. So that is just insanely cool. I just like absolutely love that bit as an example of how these kind of things work. Now, there's obviously more things going on here. We have the symbology, of course, and I want to point out one or two elements here, like the scene with Severian on the mountain with Typhon, and what's this, like the other man, and that scene. Does it remind you a bit of a scene from like the New Testament and Jesus Christ being taken met by Satan, and Satan promising him the kingdoms of the earth if he just submits? Exactly the same thing. Plus we have, Severian being the kind of person who has, changed water to wine early on in Claude the Conciliator. He has brought dead people back to life. He has healed the wounded. He has done a lot of like Christ-like things, right? He may even himself have been dead and resurrected. We don't know exactly. So we add to that story. And, the idea of Severian maybe being the new son who has to come and save mankind, being a reincarnation of the Conciliator, who may or may not be a reincarnation of the Jesus Christ story, because we also have like ideas there that the Conciliator is another one of these savior stories, right? And having the same form of like stories that happen again and again, or are put in the same form and the same symbols to mean the same kind of things. And there's a bit later on when Severian is talking about these kind of things, right? When he goes and ruminates on the meaning, or like whether symbols exist outside of what we make up or not, and whether symbols or the world is all in our imagination. He talks about like solipsism in that situation, and in a way, that is part of what he does here, right? It's like maybe Severian's life is such a symbol. Does it exist only because we're reading this specific thing into the story, or does it happen again and again anyway? It's one of those things that you have there, and I just personally feel it is just done brilliantly. Another thing that I find very interesting is Severian's remarks to the reader about how it feels to write a story, about the craft of storytelling, how stories are often unrealistic, and then claiming that he does it differently and obviously doing the exact same thing, and making the entire book as a story insanely well constructed. There's a scene later on when Severian and little Severian wander up the mountain. And it's like from far away, it looks like a small gray figure, and behind it, the huge shadow of a torturer. You see what he does there, right? So he takes these images, these scenes from earlier books, and then makes them appear in your mind in a completely different light, in a completely different perspective, that I find absolutely interesting, absolutely fascinating. What else do we do here that's really interesting? Um, there's a scene almost at the end when Severian talks to the aliens, and we have the mask, and behind it another mask, and behind it another mask, which you can definitely read as a symbol for this text that has all these different like surface layers, different layers of meaning, stuff that we interpret into it, and the way we read it, and the way we think about it. And there's all of that in there. But then at the same time, it's also just a very fascinating story to follow, with actual adventure and crap, in very unique ways, because the world building is so unique. It has all these, exotic. I don't want to use the word exotic, but you know what I mean. Like very, very different ways. The lake with people living on these islands. Are these islands? Do we just not understand Severian? How much of the heavy lifting is our imagination doing there? Because Gene Wolfe just gives us the license to do all of that. I just like that's super fascinating to have that bit there, and then you have the idea of some of the creatures, the alien stuff, right? We have the scene with the salamander, the monsters, the sheer world building there, or the Alzabo. Once again, the Alzabo is one of the most fascinating, creepy, scary monsters in fantasy fiction that I've come across. Like a monster, clearly a monster, an animal that eats humans and then can absorb part of their personality and, at least for a time, recall them and speak with their voice. Holy shit, man! That's like horror movie monster right there, like the really scary bits. And yeah, we have all of these aspects to it in there as well, which I personally really appreciate about it. Plus, we have a still fundamentally not likable main character. And I think it's very interesting to talk about that and look at that, because, the story is still told by Severian, and Severian is not a good guy. And Severian does a lot of justifying his actions in situations where you, the reader, are like, what? I get it, Severian. You don't need to justify that. And then he goes and treats women like shit. And I'm like, maybe you should think about that. And he's like, no, I'll just I'll just fuck that woman, and then he doesn't actually execute her, but he's like, he has like, and this is interesting, because the way we get this through our first person narrative in this regard is that because all the things that are completely normal for Severian, he just does not explain. And the things he does explain or justify are things that are like very different, are stuff that seems to be completely acceptable to us oftentimes. So what we get through that, once again, this brings me back to that weird sense of alienation or distance, is that we get a distance in morality as well, in our moral codes, and what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. We see that with Severian and the way he behaves towards people, the way his morals work or don't work. And I think that also adds to that feeling of distance that can make this book so hard to read. Now let's look at a bit of final structure, because once again what we see here a lot of, and we've seen it before, but I feel it's a bit stronger in this one, is Severian pausing to address the reader with smaller exercises in philosophy, where he's basically reporting philosophy or claiming to report philosophy that he may have just like made up, and so forth. And I think that's why I said earlier it's a Baroque writing style. Not only that Wolfe uses prose that is very Baroque in the way his sentence structure is and the vocabulary he uses, but also this meandering storytelling style that stops to then give us this small, I don't want to say etude, but it feels like, the French etude, like a small vignette of introducing us to a specific bit of philosophical speculation, and connecting it with like an appeal to like a larger authority of it is known that. This is something that you find a lot in like older texts. When I say older, I mean like more like 17th, 18th century texts, right? Where you have exactly those sorts of like philosophical asides in a way that serve a larger purpose and are always tied into the events of the story or what the narrator just describes. And when it comes to events, then they are explicitly tied to specific ideas of philosophy. And once again, because the way Wolfe uses philosophy here and the kinds of philosophy he puts out there, we also once again get this feeling of slight alienation, of distance in a way, because this is a style that we don't have a lot of today, right? We read books and there's actions happening, but usually the author does not step back and then tell us, yes, and this is because of this philosophical paradigm that I am trying to explain here. Like, we don't get that usually within the text. But because these like explanations and explications of events into philosophy are still part of the fiction, it adds that like additional layer, that second or third mask to it, where it feels like we have a text plus its annotations, and the annotations are still the text. So that, yeah, it's pretty fucking postmodern in a lot of ways, I feel. Plus, of course, we have those recourses to other bits and pieces of the story, right? The old man telling the story of Fetchin, the artist, who was mentioned by the picture cleaner in Claw of the Conciliator in the House Absolute. He talks about having an actual painting of Fetchin and having seen the artist Fetchin once when he was like very young. He has seen the old artist Fetchin. Now this old man in the middle of nowhere remembers his history when he was a boy together with Fetchin, which really fucking cool, because it ties all these elements together in a very natural seeming way, because these bits and pieces pop up in the least expected places, just like they would in our world. And then obviously the ending with Talos and Baldanders, when we have Baldanders, actually explaining that Baldanders is in charge and is just very, very old and just keeps on growing. Maybe going into the ocean, just like those giant women under the sea that we have met earlier on. So having that idea there, plus obviously the explanation of what the aliens do with humanity, which is, trying to not intervene while intervening and so forth. There's so much going on in this book that makes it so fascinating to me. There's an amazing thing going down with those aliens that already, bow to what's his name, to Severian, and one of them calls him liege. What's all of that about? And why do they know? There's a really cool trick, but I'll wait with that one until we talk about Citadel of the Autarch, because it gets explained there, is what I'm trying to say. But yeah. That's bits and pieces we have here. We finally get like the bit with Dorcas, where finally Severian understands what we, the reader, have understood for a long, long time. And I feel those are also like interesting bits that we get through that unreliable narrator when we see that Severian is not a very smart person in a lot of ways. And we see things that he just writes down and does not understand at the time. But because he writes this down as his memoirs, so to speak, when he writes that story about Dorcas and finding her and all of that stuff, when he writes that down fictitiously, right, he already knows, but he leaves it out in order for the reader to have the same experience as Severian. Which then is interesting because it means that he withholds stuff from us, the reader, until he deems it to be appropriate for whatever his goals are. Which should make us highly suspicious of the stuff that he's leaving out or is not saying. And this is what makes it so fascinating as a puzzle book for people that are like me, that try to puzzle out stuff. Right? For the story, it is not for what G. Wolfe is trying to tell us. It is absolutely not always important what, Severian means by specific things, or what Severian is leaving out or not. But it can be so much fun to just puzzle out and try to figure out what he's leaving out consciously, what he's leaving out subconsciously, what he's leaving out just for dramatic purposes. And create this dialogue in a way between a fictitious character and narrator and us, the reader, where we try to figure that guy out, almost play like detective, trying to accuse Severian of being, a criminal, I guess, in some form or other, trying to actually, catch him out in lies, catch him out in omissions, and so forth. And this is, I think, the huge talent, what makes Severian such a fantastic character in literature, is how easy it is for us, the reader, to step into that dialogue with that fictitious character, try to, read aspects of his character, his morals, his opinions, and so forth. Try to read them into a text and build a character who is almost never actually described in the way a traditional non-first person narrative describes anyone, right? There's a scene in this book where we get almost for the first time a description of how he looks in that scene when he has that interaction with Syriaca, and she tries to, and this is once again so fascinatingly symbolic, right? She tries to guess his looks through the mask, which is exactly what we, the reader, do with Severian, and the mask being the text that we get. We're trying to figure out who's the guy behind it. And that's just so fucking amazing to me, because it's not something that we usually do when we read. I mean, it's something we always do, but usually we do it very subconsciously. And thus reading the Book of the New Sun is so much a book about reading fantasy, a book about what it means to read fantasy books, what it means to be a reader, and all the, something that will lead us to examine all the things we do when we sit down to read a book. We read it to get entertained. We read it to learn stuff. We read it to find out things. And it's still, so much of it is our own imagination that we put into the text, because we always have that mask between us and that idea behind it, if there is an idea behind it. Or maybe it is just the mask. It's one of those things that we need to talk about when we get back to Citadel of the Autarch, and then maybe even Earth of the New Sun. Anyway, I've rambled enough. I fucking love this book. Well, you already know that. I hope you found some interesting bits and pieces in this one. I know a lot of people have recently read it with Media Death Cult and other situations. So if you have, let me know what you think about it. Did you like it more than Claw or Shadow? Do you still dislike it? What were your favorite bits and pieces? Which set piece? The Typhon one? The magic duel that we didn't talk about now? All of these options. What's your favorite bit? Let me know in the comments. Like, subscribe, share. Do all those things. And I'll talk about a different book tomorrow. Well, how about that? So yeah, have a great day. Cheers.